and good afternoon. My name is Fatma Bihag and I am the Head of Marketing at JustGo. We are delighted to have you join us today for the first webinar of the series as part of our newly launched Global Safeguarding campaign. We're honoured to have Kate Hills, Head of Safeguarding at Swim Island, a valued JustGo customer, to host today's webinar titled Safeguarding Our Athletes, Understanding Safe Sport, alongside JustGo's Commercial Director, Phil Robinson, to discuss what safeguarding athletes really means, the role sports governing bodies should play in ensuring safe sport, how you can identify and prevent safeguarding risks, how to develop a collaborative approach to safeguarding. Kate has been working with Swim Island as the head of safeguarding and the National Children's Officer for 18 years, overseeing changes to legislation and safeguarding practices to ensure that Swim Island's safeguarding policies are up to date and relevant for the sport. Kate also sits on strategic groups for safeguarding children in sport for Sport Island and Sport Northern Ireland. Before we begin today's discussion, I would like to highlight a few key points to consider as part of today's webinar. So the webinar is being recorded for those who cannot join us live today and will be shared as an on-demand link afterwards, and that link will be made accessible to everybody who has joined the webinar also for reference. Given the fact we are recording the webinar, please do be mindful of sharing any personal information or details around specific safeguarding issues or risks you may have dealt with or are currently facing. All information shared will be done so on a more general level. If you do have any specific questions or concerns, do feel free to share those privately with our speakers in the question panel and chat function, and they will respond to you individually after the webinar. Feel free to submit any general questions in the chat box, which you should be able to see on that right-hand navigation of your screen. You can do so throughout the webinar. I will do our best to respond to those questions live at the end of today's webinar or directly afterwards as a follow-up. So again, thank you so much for joining us online today. We are hoping to have this webinar covered off in about 45 minutes. We hope you find it informative and that you will join us for future webinars as part of our Global Safeguarding series. With that, I'll hand it over to Phil Robinson and Kate Hills. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Phil Robinson. I'm the Commercial Director here at JustGo. I don't think I need to say anything more other than to just introduce Kate and ask her to introduce herself, and then we'll crack on with the webinar. Kate.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much, Phil, and thanks for JustGo for inviting me. I suppose I just, in introducing myself, Fatma's already said, what I do, but I think it might be quite good for you guys to know where I've come from. I've obviously been working with Swim Island for 18 years, but for 10 years prior to that, I was actually a volunteer in sport. I was a director of, sat on the board of a sporting organisation. I was involved in the technical aspect of that sport. And eventually, because I was the best at I was told I was the best at the job, I became the National Children's Officer as a volunteer in that sport. And my interest in working with young people in sport just grew from there. And I don't know whether it's the same in your countries or in your national governing bodies, but there's very little to say exactly what kind of training you should have. It's a very niche market we work in, and I was delighted to be able to kind of start that sharing of our experiences, which I think this is the first of, Phil, if I can say that. And I think what's really important is that people understand that this is a role that it's almost a vocational role, and I found that, and there's always something new to learn. I've done a master's in child welfare and protection. I'm doing a PhD, doctoral studies in childhood studies, And none of these have any connection with sport. So it is what we make of it. So just a little bit about my background, hopefully that will just encourage people.
Thank you, Kate. Really, just to start off with the title of this webinar being Safeguarding Our Athletes, I suppose a good way to start is what does safeguarding of athletes actually mean, Kate?
Well, I think, look, I don't know what the background of people that are joining this webinar is, but for me, starting out, it's just actually that fundamental understanding of the terminology that we're using. For us in Ireland, I work across the island of Ireland. You know, we've talked about child protection, child welfare. So you need to have a grasp. We kind of split the area into two. So we talk about safeguarding and we talk about child protection. And what is important is that you understand the differences between those. So for me, child protection is talking about or is dealing with concerns of harm of abuse. So we're talking about perhaps the person of concern. And again, what is the terminology that's used in your jurisdiction? Person of concern, perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator. Then we're talking about victims, or the person making a disclosure I've heard that it called that. And very often we refer to people who've been victims of abuse as survivors. And then within that threshold, it's about, within that context, it's about understanding what the thresholds are to report. Now, we would report to what we would call the statutory authorities. So whatever your agency is that actually deals with frontline child protection, we would call them statutory authorities. So what are their thresholds? And putting that all together under the heading child protection, you kind of understand, right, that's the serious side of it. That's the piece that actually, as a sports organization, we don't have control of. Our job is to pass that on. But then we come to the really bigger piece, which is safeguarding. And under that comes everything, basically everything else. So a lot of organizations will talk about lower level concerns. A lot of organizations might talk about best practice. And for me and my role, that's what we set as a national governing body. So it's really important that we have an understanding of that difference between safeguarding and child protection. So what is acceptable? What do we mean by well-being? What is the culture of our organization? What is the ethos of our organization? What is our engagement with young people? So if we think about those two terms, and I hope I've given you kind of some sort of explanation around them that you can kind of drill down and understand in your own context. The role of the national governing body is to actually recognise those two differences, and then within that we set the standards. So I can't set the standards in Swim Ireland about what is to be reported unless I understand the thresholds to report to the statutory authorities. And then everything underneath that is then what is the culture of our sport, what is the culture of our national governing body. What is really important about setting standards is that they're based on empirical evidence and empirical practice. Don't sit in an ivory tower and just say, oh, this sounds good or that sounds good. It's got to be really practical. And also the other thing about setting standards is they've got to touch every level. So that, it's got to be from the top down. And a lot of people say, well, grassroots up. Well, I would suggest it's got to be top down. So hopefully, Phil, that's.
No, that's perfect, Kate. And because I was actually going to ask you about the role of national governing bodies, but taking that further, Obviously, clubs and all of the affiliates associated with the national governing body play their part as well. Could you just expand a little bit on that and what role they take and how a governing body would ensure that those policies, those procedures are adhered to by the national governing body, please?
I think that's a really important question, Phil. When we look at our sport, sport is run, predominantly in a club situation. I mean, that's what we're here today. That's what JustGo is really good at doing, is putting that, that structure around clubs and what they need. But those clubs are run by all different sorts of people, from all walks of life. Some of them are well-meaning, some of them are incredibly knowledgeable, some of them have intentions, and now those intentions can be really positive or they can be really negative. So I think what you need to do is recognize that. I mean, that's really important. The world is made up, we know the world is made up of all sorts of different people. Our sport is made up of all sorts of different people, and bringing those people together under the auspices of your sport, under your sports club, means to say that you've got to give them, as a national governing body, you've got to give them the guidance under which they should operate. And by setting the standards at national governing body level, they become the standards for all. They become the cornerstone of how everybody in your sport behaves. And it means that I mentioned this ivory tower, I'm not sitting in an ivory tower deciding that that's how we need to behave, or that's how, we need to communicate with people. It's a standard that's set across all sports, and it applies across all sports. So, and the other beauty of that is that it actually means that it's not Kate Hills or Phil Robinson personally making a decision about what is acceptable and not acceptable. It is about the standard that the national governing body are setting, and the standard that we expect as a national governing body, our clubs, to follow. And I think what's really important is if you can get that message across to clubs, then that's your starting point. Okay, so it's about actually giving them the policies, the procedures, the standards, if you like. We'll talk about standards, giving them the standards to operate to, and actually why you're doing that, what the standards mean. It means that your club children's officer or your chairperson or your coach, when they're responding to somebody, is responding on behalf of the club, on behalf of the national governing body, not their personal opinion. It's not their value, that their own personal value they put on that. Understanding why a standard is in place is really important, and I referred to that earlier, and I just want to use the analogy about photographs in a changing room. In Ireland, if you take photographs in a changing room and possibly get a naked or a near naked young person, it's actually a criminal offence. And yet, if we think about how young people act together, their phones are an extension of their hands. They're always messaging, they're always taking pictures, they're always, they're involved with each other through their technology. And young people actually don't understand that what they could be doing is a criminal offence. So it's actually explaining why you're putting that standard in place. You also need to understand your jurisdiction may have laws. There may be different laws, so you need to understand what is a law and what is a rule. Now, we're really challenged in Swim Ireland because we operate in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, two different legal jurisdictions. So we have to bring the legal standards, if you like, together and decide how we're going to manage that. So basically, if something is law in one jurisdiction, it will be a rule in Swim Ireland in another. So again, if you are in that same boat, understanding what your law is, what your law states, and the law may be you obviously have to abide by the law, but it may not be a high enough standard for you, in which case you then need to decide and set your standard. The key people are really important. So identify your key people. So in your club, who is your key person in your club that your communication goes to? Who is involved in safeguarding in your staff, in your NGB? I'm in a really fortunate position that the next in line to me is my CEO. So that's where we sit safeguarding in our organization. Staff in an NGB tend to be more permanent. So, you know, it's about collaboration with the different departments in your NGB, and there is a bit of a fear factor there. You know, you've got to build up a rapport, that if Kate Hills, National Children's Officer, Head of Safeguarding, rings you, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but it is about building up that rapport with your colleagues within your national governing body, but also recognizing that the vast majority of sport is actually operated by our volunteers. And volunteers, no disrespect to them, but they do tend to be transient. So you need to build in that that awareness, that sharing of safeguarding standards, and that messaging around what is acceptable and not acceptable in your sport. You've got to build in that time to make sure your message is persistent, because, you know, if you get a change of committee, you've got to have the time, and you've got to build in the time in your program to actually make sure that your new committee coming forward are aware of that. What I found, funny enough, since COVID, is actually one of the really key messages is about keeping your volunteers engaged. I have a direct line to a role in our clubs called the Club Children's Officer. Now, they may, you know, in other NGBs, it could be referred to Child Protection Officer, Children's Officer, Child Welfare Officer, Safeguarding Officer, whatever it's called. I have a direct line to them. And I now have a monthly forum with them on every month, and I have done since March 2020. And what I found is that they're more engaged, they're more aware of what our safeguarding standards are, and they're more likely to come and check things with me. So I've kind of interpreted that with the more engaged you keep people, the better aware they become, and the more likely they are to engage with you. And I think the last piece you asked me there, Phil, was around the audit piece. And that's really challenging for a lot of people, especially where there is, you know, a lot of NGBs operate on kind of like very short staffed. But there are a lot of things you can do. And again, I was laughing about this with Phil. I'm not paid to say this, but the JustGo affiliation is always our starting point. It is the starting point for our audit for the clubs for the rest of the season. So at affiliation, we remove all the roles from our people. They can't be appointed a role without the necessary safeguarding requirements. So it is such a good starting point for us. And I think choosing a starting point that you can measure, and you can say, okay, at that point, everybody that was appointed to a role met our safeguarding standards. And it may be very different for the NGBs that are here today, but it is really important to have that starting point. And you may need a few iterations, you know, of where that might be. It may be perhaps at a competition level, or it might be at the end of the season, whatever. But to have that starting point where I can say to my CEO, yeah, everybody who signed up to our clubs has met our safeguarding requirements. And that's really important.
Yeah, Kate, thank you so much, because I mean, for me, one of the things that I've learned in the 8 years that I've been working with JustGo is that the clubs are the eyes, they are the ears, and there's also, as well as that, they are the critical representatives of the governing body pushed down, and they are the people that at the end of the day, our members all connect through. and quite often it's that that their personal affiliation is. So thank you for going into that detail, because I did actually see questions coming up relating to that. So you preempted that. Kate, you've touched on one or two things regarding, if you like, the criteria of how you identify risk, but can you just expand upon that, and how you would identify the risks, how you would prevent those risks, and I suppose that the protocols around that as well, please?
Yeah, and again, I think that's a really important thing, and I'm going to kind of put my neck out here. Preventing risk is idealistic, and we have to accept that in everything that we do in our entire lives, there is an element of risk to it, and I think we need to recognize that in the safeguarding world. And I think if you try and pretend otherwise, you're on a losing pathway to begin with. What we can do with risk is reduce and accept. So, but knowing what we're accepting, what risk we're accepting, is a really important factor. So identify the risks. People are always a risk. We don't know the backgrounds of where people are coming from. We don't necessarily know their intentions. I am incredibly cynical about everybody's intention, but that's my job. I don't let that cloud my judgment when I'm putting things in place. But I do know that the nicest, brightest person can also have quite a dark past to them. So people are always a risk. Places, they could possibly be a risk. We're a sports. We're the aquatic. Our sport is aquatics. All the aquatics. We operate out of facilities that are already built, so we have no choice. We can't go change things. So again, you walk into a building, look at where the risk areas are, and then look at your practices. So basically, people, places, and practices. You've got to identify the risks for those three things. And the risks are where young people and adults mix, where young people are being coached, trained, supervised, looked after, whatever we do with young people in our sport context, where they mix with adults, there is going to be a risk. So identify that. And I think the thing about this is be consistent, be upfront, and be fair. One of the things I was trying to think of an analogy about lessening risk, because it's always kind of, you don't want to kind of say, well, actually that's less of a risk. And actually a really good one around people. So we know what we need to train them. We need to do their checks, the vetting checks. We've got the protocols in place, and that's really good. All right. But if you get a child left outside of a swimming pool at 8:30 on a December night, December in Ireland is notoriously wet and raining. All right. And it's dark, and and our protocol says you're the only adult there, and you are not allowed to take a child in a car. All right. So what are we actually saying? That it's acceptable to leave that child outside a facility, or do we actually take steps to actually safeguard that child, lessening the risk of having a lone adult and a single child in a car together? All right. So just as using that example, phone somebody, the adult phones somebody, phone their parents, they let somebody know, they sit the child in the back seat. So there are loads of things you can do about lessening the risk. So be careful about setting protocols that actually, if you look at that analogy, actually put that child at greater risk. So places, I talked about places, check them out, know the lie of the land. If you do away trips, understand where your young people are staying. Are they in single rooms, triple rooms? Go into a swimming pool, look at where the blind spots are. Where can a person stand and have a conversation with a child that nobody can see them? you know, are the public present? Do you have to negotiate, you know, public in changing rooms and things like that? And the practice piece takes us straight back to our protocols. So those are setting the scene, you know, what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. The other part of that is giving people the confidence in raising an issue. And that is really important, because when we want to know about issues, because we can learn from issues. But if a child is in danger of being harmed, we also need our volunteers to have the confidence to report that to us so we can actually take steps. So it is listen, acknowledge, believe. I mean, those will be the three things. Listen to what the person's telling them, acknowledge what they've told them, and believe it. It's not up to us, especially if we're talking about a child that's at risk of being harmed. It's not up to us to decide. That goes to child protection, to the statutory authorities. And our protocols, by having the protocols in place, it means that we deal with things fairly and people know what to expect. So Phil, I hope that kind of answers.
It does, Kate, and thank you, because I hope to goodness the audience has seen there. I mean, what you did there with your analogy is look at both the directs, but as well as the indirects, because you gave examples there that maybe people wouldn't actually think of. And it's still related to safeguarding. We always think of safeguarding being associated with a direct thing, a coach, a trainer, or whatever, associating with vulnerable people. Let's just remove it from pure children. This is all adults, as we've seen, dare I say, in many sports, and the feedback we've seen in the news, sadly. So I hope that's really opened a few people's eyes and ears to that. I mean, just I suppose reaching back to the club concept and the critical people who are the key personnel within clubs. I mean, what support is needed for these safeguarding personnel? Because you've mentioned there that, you know, the huge majority of people, well, just about everybody associated with the clubs is a volunteer. How do you ensure that they're suitably qualified and aware of the protocols and adhere to whatever those policies are, Kate?
I think, I mean, for me, that's really about. I mean, there are a number of things that come into that. So we've identified the risk, making that risk a reality, and you know, making the implementation of the standards that you put in place is really important. What is acceptable practice? We talked about traveling with the child. As an NGB, don't leave a grey area. You know, decide what is acceptable practice. I mean, some of the obstacles that we see, and if I can talk about the obstacles, then it may be, then we can recognize the support. So kind of the obstacles: untrained people, people having rogue ideas about things, people actually, and I hate to say this, but they're kind of dinosaurs. They live in, well, it was never done like that in my day. You know, I remember the day when my children were little. You know, you got a whole football team in the back of a Peugeot van. I mean, today you would never think about doing that. So, you know, times have moved on, and we do need to recognize how we keep young people safe. So making sure that people are always going to try and bend rules. And, you know, you have a set of rules because you have a set of rules. So make sure that they are applied consistently. The culture of the organization is so important. And that kind of leads on to the hierarchy of support that I think kind of people in my position do need. There should be no gap. I've mentioned this before. There should be no gap between the safeguarding lead in a national governing body and the top table. You know, I have a direct relationship with my CEO. The children's officers in our club have a direct relationship with me. And it's breaking down those barriers. Now, depending on the size of your organization, you might have a different structure. So you might need more layers, but make sure that those layers are continuous. So if something comes to me from our clubs, I can, and obviously the CEO doesn't get everything, she gets the important stuff, but there is actually no barrier for the clubs to come to me and for me to go to what I call, the top in our organization. The more layers you have, the more opportunity there is to miss something. So again, that falls back into the risk. Identify that as a risk. One of the things, that we had as an organization, we had back in 1999, we had the Murphy Report, which was an investigation into child abuse in swimming in Ireland. And one of the identified issues there was the missing of information, because the layer went from the clubs to the region and then to the national governing body. And the region was made up of a number of volunteers, and they then made the decision as to whether that was important. All right. So again, it's identifying those key people, and not to put a not to say that anybody that your volunteers will miss things, but it's about recognizing the layers and what the risks are attended in that. As a national governing body lead in safeguarding, it is really important that I have somebody to talk to outside of my role, outside of my the organization, and whether that be psychology support or whether it be kind of coaching leadership support. That is really important. And don't if you're a safeguarding lead, don't think you can just carry it on your shoulders, because you can't, and you get grumpy. I've often been told I'm grumpy, but you can't carry it. Some of the things that come to you, if you were frontline child protection, you'd be getting monthly support meetings, from a supervisor. So again, that's really important. Know who to go to. Establish those relationships with, key lead people in your statutory authorities. I have a really good relationship with the National Protective Services Bureau. I have a relationship with TUSLA, which is our Child and Family Agency. I have a relationship with our Gateway team, and I have a relationship with the PSNI. So those are the kind of statutory authorities. And knowing that you can pick the phone up to somebody that will just answer you and give you a straight answer. You don't need to explain. That's really important, and that's a really important piece for support. I provide that support to our volunteers. Now, it doesn't have to be just me. We also have what we call club support officers. So they're probably counsellors at the same time, but know what your limitations are. So, for instance, if you have a really sad occurrence, we've had a couple of young people who've taken their own lives over the last couple of years. We're not bereavement counsellors. So know where your limitations as a sport are, know what those limitations are, and actually provide a link, a signpost to those services that can provide that proper support as well. And you can do that at a regional level. So if it happens at a regional level, you can help the club identify the regional services, and that's really important. Recognize your limitations. We are used to working in sport where we are everything to everybody. Training, I did take a little bit about training, and I kind of pride myself on having put myself through kind of my master's. I've put myself through the PhD, but that's because I wanted to give this role that I do in Swim Ireland some credibility and validity, and that's really important. And it's and what kind of amused me, but also a challenge, and made me realize that there isn't somewhere for us to go as safeguarding leads in sport. We don't have a qualification. There might be various courses that we can do, during my doctorate, I had to do 8 modules. 7 of those modules I was able to give them a sport leaning. So I did about transgender in sport, I did about children's rights in sport. But the people that were marking it had no experience of sport at all. So it became a real learning place. But in return, what they taught me was around that child protection element, what social workers will go through. So I think as a safeguarding lead in a sport, that's really valuable. That training that if you can get that's really training. And I suppose the last piece I'd have to say on that is this network, this like-minded people, getting like-minded people together as we have today. And I know this is a webinar and it's very much a one-way environment at the moment, but develop that network of like-minded people. I deliver a Club Children's Officers Forum every month. It's for 1 hour, but for at least 20-25 minutes of that, I put all the children's officers into breakout rooms. I do give them a topic to discuss. The likelihood is they come back from the breakout room having not discussed the topic, but having spent that 20-25 minutes actually exchanging good practice with each other, exchanging things that they have worked well. And that is really important. Keep that connection. And I think it's good. It's sharing experience. For me, I'm the only safeguarding lead in Swim Ireland, but I know I can pick up the phone to safeguarding lead in another organisation, and we can share our experiences. So having that is really valuable.
Yeah, no, Kate, I think you've touched on a couple of really interesting points there. First of all, the absolute importance of the culture within the organisation, first of all. And I know from example and having worked with you guys for I think it's 8 or 9 years, that Swim Ireland's, yes, it is that long, Kate. Swim Ireland's culture from the top to the bottom is exemplary. And dare I say, I am aware of very, sadly, the opposite of that with 1 or 2 other organisations who I should add are not customers. It's people I've spoken with over the years who don't have the same openness, don't have the same focus on the importance of safeguarding, because as you referred to a few minutes ago, we've not had problems, so why should we worry? So that's the first thing. The second point you raised there, yeah, it can always happen somewhere. The second point is, this shouldn't be the end of the story. There should be an opportunity for a more open forum, and certainly we would love to work with you and any other organisation, child protection officer, safeguarding officer, whatever the terminology is, to broaden this thought leadership within this particular area, because I think everybody's got something to learn, and that's something that we've learned at JustGo as we've worked with, now as you're aware, over 100 national governing bodies, and that's just in our consultancy. Never mind this critical topic of safeguarding. So I suppose just one final question, Kate, and I know you're not being paid here. You referred to that a minute or 2 ago, but what is the role? What should technology and how should technology actually assist in this safeguarding area? What are those opportunities?
I think that's really that's a really challenging piece. All right. I've worked with Swim Ireland for 18 years, so I'm not going to disclose how old I am here, but for the older generation, we might look at technology as being challenging, but I think a bit like you need to accept there is risk. There's always going to be risk. We need to accept how technology has moved on, and we need to make that work for us. It's part of our lives. it's part of young people's lives. And if we really are truly focused on the young people in our sport, we need to recognize what works for them, what makes it suitable for them. It was so telling. I'm doing a charter of respect with one of the disciplines in Swim Ireland, and I was looking for young people to feed back on the kind of on the pieces that we'd already done, and they said, posters, waste of time, absolute waste of time. You can stick as many posters as you like around the facility, send us out as many pieces of paper. It won't make a difference. What makes a difference is people behaving in the right way, people understanding that they're role models. And this was from a 14-year-old. So, I mean, for me, you know, a paper copy of and sticking a poster up is not going to work for them. So what we need to understand what is going to work for our young people. So accept it. You and I, Phil, we've just been talking about the digital wallet, and it means the use of phones. And somebody actually said to me, well, you know, aren't you banning phones? No, not banning phones, banning taking images with a device. That's not banning phones. If the use of a phone can actually make sure that the coach or the team manager or the chaperone, whatever you want to call them, is compliant, then I will use that. And I think we need to embrace that. We need to look at how the use of technology can enhance. I mean, if we didn't have a membership system, JustGo, I would need a team of 4 or 5 people just to keep track of safeguarding, training, and vetting. But our system does that, keeps track of it. So I don't need that team of 4 or 5 people. We need to make sure technology works for us. So yeah, if using the digital wallet to make sure that that person's entitled to be on that deck, entitled to be a coach, has their vetting, has their safeguarding in place, and is a member of our club, then happy days. I'll take that anytime.
Wonderful, wonderful. And you did refer earlier on to the affiliation process and making sure that clubs and the club officers are aware of their obligations as well. So it's a hugely broad topic, and maybe we should organise another one to just talk about the technology at a later date, Kate.
Yeah, I think it would be fantastic, because I see there are a couple of questions in the chat, and I know probably either yourself or Fatima. I'm not quick enough to have gone through them, but a couple of them, you know, mentioned about taking the roles off the system, and you know, whose responsibility is it? And in fact, if I can just go to that, yes, it is laborious. That word just jumped out at me. It is laborious, but at some stage, somebody needs to do the checks and balances to make sure that that person's entitled to be where they are and doing the job that they are. Because if we were to allow a coach on deck, unvetted or unsafeguard trained in Ireland, all right, in the Republic of Ireland, we're breaking the law.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a simple fact. That's a simple fact. Now in Northern Ireland, it's slightly more complicated. The legislation is kind of states a different thing, and that's where I come from in actually matching up the different legislations. So a coach being on deck who's unvetted and unsafeguard trained is a legal requirement in the Republic of Ireland, is a Swim Ireland rule requirement in Northern Ireland. So again, you know, we've set that standard. It's very clear. It doesn't matter whether our young people are in a club on the border or come from a club in the north to a competition, or vice versa, move to the north for a competition. The standard is the same across the board, and that's really important.
Yeah. Okay, Kate. Well, amazingly, what's 45 minutes gone to? What a surprise! I have, as Kate referenced there's been a good number of questions that have come in, and what we'll do is we'll actually respond to each of these as a follow-up to this webinar session. But Kate, can I just say a huge thank you for your time, your expertise, your your knowledge and your willingness to share this with everybody today. I hope that everybody's gained an awful lot of this, gained an awful lot from this session. It's certainly been a pleasure for me. Can I pass back to Fatima now and just let her close out remarks, please?
Can I just say one more thing, Phil? And apologies because Phil wasn't expecting me. I think we've just touched on it. And I think this idea, if we can get a group like this together again, and hear more voices, because there's a lot more to safeguarding in sport than what we've covered today. And I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity for sharing part of it with you guys as well. Sorry, Fatima, over to you.
Thank you both so much. And again, to everybody who has submitted a question, we appreciate it so much, and we will continue the conversation offline, and we'll be sure to follow up with each of you individually. And I think some of the questions raised also can be covered off in future webinar topics. So thank you, Phil and Kate, for an informative safeguarding webinar discussion. A lot of interesting points and examples shared by Kate, and no doubt, there's lots more questions on this specific topic. So as I said, we will do our best to follow up separately. Safeguarding is one of JustGo's core pillars and something we should all be responsible for in sport. Many of our customers globally work with us to support their safeguarding initiatives and create a better, safer environment for their communities. We recently launched our global safeguarding campaign, and we have had a lot of interest in this specific topic, and we're very open to feedback and to questions. So do let us know if you have specific topics in safeguarding that you would like us to cover on future webinars or to cover off directly on follow-ups. Feel free to email those through to me directly. I will be in touch with everybody with the on-demand link. And of course, you can contact Phil directly, email shown on slide. If we can support your safeguarding initiatives and you would like to find out more about how our solutions are serving the needs of over 100 national sports governing bodies globally, please don't hesitate to get in touch. To Kate's point about coming together again as a community, we are very open to hosting private virtual roundtables. So again, topics that are perhaps not suitable for a general webinar such as this, we would be open to hosting such a roundtable format. So again, please do let us know if that's of interest, and we'll happily get that organized. Again, this webinar was recorded. Everybody will receive the link. Kate shared a lot of valuable insights, and you will have access to those, be it today or tomorrow. If you did submit a question, as I said, follow-up will happen, so be rest assured. We will not ignore you. We will be in touch. On behalf of the JustGo team, thank you. We look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Thank you both very much.